All right, we should be live now. So welcome everybody. Now we are now getting into our second presentation of the day. I hope everyone that attended Greg's presentation this morning thought it was very insightful. Just to remind everyone as well, we will have recordings of every one of these presentations, and each of these presentations will also be featured as articles in our next July-August issue as well. But let's start out. Our next one is have an introduction. So we are joined with Tim McRae. He is the Account Technical Manager of Thermal and Specialized Solutions with Chemours Canada. His presentation today will be on a deep dive into refrigerant innovations, A2L compliance, and what it means for Canada. Thank you so much, Tim, for speaking at our presentation today. I'm going to kick it off. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. And certainly thank you to Plumbing and HVAC Publication for inviting us, and thanks to Leah, Francisco, and also Mark. We really appreciate this opportunity, and we really appreciate the time that you guys are spending with me and with us here today. I know it's getting warm out, and there's opportunities to be up on roofs and fixing things. And for those of you on vacation and that, it's that season is coming up rapidly. I know my son finished school yesterday, So anyway, to get started, who am I? I'll mention a little bit. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I've been with Chemours, which was previously the DuPont refrigerants business, for 34 years. I am located in Canada, and I'm part of CSA B52. I'm on the board of Refrigerant Management Canada, some other things like that. So I have been around this industry for quite a few years. Again, I really look forward to this opportunity to talk to you guys here today. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about regulations in Canada, the US, A2Ls, the Opteon refrigerants. Opteon is really the brand name that we as Chemours have adopted for the lower GWP refrigerants. Freon is the old brand, Opteon is the new brand. We're going to talk about A2L, safety and handling, and we're going to talk about codes and standards. Now, we only do have about 45 minutes, so I'm going to move pretty quickly here. So the first thing is regulations. And we don't always talk about regulations in the US, what's the point? But in this case, it's going to impact us directly here in Canada, I think. So it's important to understand the regulations in the US and in Canada. In Canada, we call them ODSHAR regulations. In the US, it's called the AIM Act, or Technology Transition. So at the highest level, those in the industry are certainly well aware of the Montreal Protocol and the phase out of CFCs and HCFCs like R22 and Freon 11. But the Kigali amendments were added, which is a phase down of HFCs. It's not a phase out, it's a phase down. And Canada's adoption of those regulations was really, of the Kigali amendments, started in 2016. That's when the ODSHAR regulations were updated to include the phase down of HFCs. At that time, the US had adopted some similar regulations, but due to various reasons, their regulations that were kind of similar to what Canada adopted were abandoned for some time. And it wasn't until 2023 in October that the US has adopted new regulations. And time had passed, so between 2016 and 2023, some innovations had come about, new refrigerants had been approved. So the new US regulations have kind of leapfrogged where Canada's at. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk very quickly about the Canada regulations and then jump into the US regulations. So the first thing is the Canadian regulations, the ODSHAR. There's two parts to it. Is the phase down of HFCs, and the second part is the specific prohibitions and new equipment. Now, it's important to note that Environment Canada has started the review process of these regulations. Where are they going to end up? Historically, the Canadian regulations ended up similar to the US. That's kind of what occurred in the past. And also, if they don't, it could create some hardship in Canada around limiting equipment and further driving up costs of food and these types of things if the regulations don't. But one would suggest that Environment Canada will somewhat align with the updated US regulations, but time will tell. So the first thing is the cap and reduction. So this is where the GWP refrigerants is multiplied by how many kilograms are imported, and they come up with a cap, and then there's a reduction. So we're already at the 60% reduction, and it's been quite successful thus far. But a big part of it has been automotive, a move to a low GWP refrigerant called 1234YF. Foams has moved to a low GWP solutions as well, which was very painful in that industry, but they too have moved. And of course, in our sector, we've also seen refrigerants move to lower GWP, non-flammable A1 refrigerants like 448, 449, etc. But certainly as time marches on, we need to start introducing even lower GWP solutions, many of which will fall into this A2L category. So how is Canada doing? So this chart was provided by Environment Canada and Climate Change. And you can see here, the green line is the cap. And you can see here's the reduction in 2024. The blue bars are how much Canada has been consuming versus the quota. So you can see here that in 2023 that Canada did consume well below the cap, but certainly was above what the cap was reduced to in 2024, and certainly well above what the cap will be in 2029. So we really need to start transitioning to lower GWP solutions, particularly in new equipment, because it takes time for that equipment to get established and into the marketplace, and the transition into service gases thereafter. So the second part of the Canadian regulations is the segment-specific controls. So again, the US had implemented similar numbers, and some states had gone along with very similar regulations to this. But certainly you can see we're already, for centralized, not allowed to use GWPs greater than 2200 in new equipment. A couple of new ones that are coming up at the end of this year will be chillers, air conditioning and refrigeration. Chillers will have a GWP limit of 750 for new equipment. And mobile, the reefer trailers and that type of thing will be limited to 2200. And it's interesting because the new US regulations propose or have in there similar values to this. So let's jump into the US regulations. It's a hundreds of page document, the US regulations. And this is kind of a very high level summary of some of the areas that are critical that you'll see, but please refer to the EPA for the regulations. They do have some cheat sheets in there that you can look at. But you can see a couple of things that they have: rooftops, ducted splits, mini splits. The manufacturing date of January 2025, so less than 6 months away, you can see that they can no longer manufacture equipment with a GWP greater than 700 in these sectors. They will allow sell-throughs of existing equipment, so up to 2028. But you can imagine that the manufacturers are already converting to low GWP refrigerants to replace primarily in this sector 410A in new equipment. And they're certainly not going to build 3 years worth of equipment. So as the US transitions, manufacturers in Canada, the US, and around the world are transitioning their manufacturing facilities to go away from 410A to lower GWP solutions to meet these requirements. On the refrigeration side, you can see here that there's also some GWP limits on systems. Again, this is kind of a summary, and you can see here 150 GWP limit on larger systems greater than 200 pounds, 300 GWP limit on systems less than 200 pounds, and chillers, as I mentioned before, a 700 value 2025, similar to what Canada already has in place of a 750 for 2025. But the important thing, you can see that in different sectors, there's 700 GWP limit for chillers, and also for refrigeration and air conditioning, residential, light commercial, 300 for smaller systems, refrigeration, and 150 for larger systems and refrigeration. So those are three numbers that are important to remember: the 700, 300, and 150. So at this point, we wanted to do a quick poll. I don't know if Leah, if you can take over to do the poll.
Absolutely. All right. So I actually have already published the poll. I did it a few minutes, like less than a minute ago now. So some people are already starting to vote in. So for those of you who haven't found it, if you look on the right hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a chat, and then there's a poll function as well. So if you just click the poll function, there's actually a little bit of a green button. It looks like from my end. I'm not sure if that's what you guys see. So just feel free to vote in. So as you can see also on our slide, so the question we're asking our audience today is, when will you install your first A2L system? So we'll give you a couple more seconds to get your votes in. Let us know if anybody's struggling to find it. Otherwise, I'm going to close the poll in a few more seconds. This is when we can do some Jeopardy noises kind of going off.
Yeah, certainly the A2Ls, I mean, they're coming in. We've seen equipment in Canada already in certain applications, but yeah, it's a thought would be a good poll question to ask.
Yeah, no, it is. And we were discussing prior to the presentation whether or not you guys wanted to include the I already have. And I'm happy to say we have had 2 people already vote that they've already installed a system using A2L. So there are some people out there awesome already. Some seem to never, but that's okay. I'm going to give you guys another, I'm going to count down to 10. I'm going to use my fingers for this. Okay, guys? And then we're going to end the poll. We're going to do this very old school style now. All right. 3 more seconds. 2, last chance to put your vote in. All right. We're going to end the poll. I don't know if you want to go over it, Tim. Otherwise, the stage is back yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. I can't see the results. So I guess that's one of the problems that I've had here. But
here, I'm back on stage. All right. So you should actually be able to see them also on the right-hand side. If you see, there's the chat and people's polls. If you don't, I can read it out for you. That's no problem.
Sure,
That's why
go ahead. Yeah.
We have a team member here to help you out. So to let you guys all know, so we had 2 votes that said that they already have. We have 7 votes that are saying that they'll be using it this year. 10 votes for next year. 4 votes for the next 2. 2 votes for not for a while, so 2027 plus. And then the last one was never, was 3 people. So, all right. Handing it back over to you, Tim.
All right. Well, thank you for doing the poll. That's not unexpected as to kind of the profile that we've seen. That certainly with the manufacturers transitioning, A2Ls are going to play an important role in refrigeration sectors, everything from, smaller units to air conditioning to chillers. So it's really going to move, and it's good to see that you guys are coming out with saying that, yeah, some are going to start this year, but really I think as we move 2025 and beyond is where it's really going to ramp up. So understanding A2L, so let's quickly go through some slides on A2Ls and just understanding what they are. The first thing, and this is very important, A2L refrigerants, this class of refrigerants, are not to be used in retrofit. They are used for new equipment only. The time may come, but certainly where we stand today, A2Ls or even hydrocarbons, which are A3s, are not to be used in retrofit of existing systems. So you cannot retrofit a 410A system to 32 or 454B at A2L class refrigerants. The next thing I wanted to show you is from the ASHRAE numbers like 513A or 454A, you really can't tell whether refrigerant, what class it is. You really need to look at the ASHRAE standard 34. But one thing we did with our brand names, XP says it's in the same class as R22 in terms of flammability, no flame propagation, whereas XL in our designation shows that this is an A2L. And our competitors have done similar things with their nomenclatures as well. Around that. You'll also see some other changes. The next thing I wanted to show is that we have different governing organizations such as ASHRAE, such as GHS, what we see on the SDSs, or Transportation of Dangerous Goods. So when you look at these different governing bodies, they will classify the 2Ls differently. So you can see here's the A2Ls here, the XLs according to the Opteon brand. you'll see that under ASHRAE 34, they're called 2L. So this is what you would see in the building codes like CSA B52, ASHRAE Standard 15. GHS, so this is what you see on the SDS sheets, which would require or which would be used for handling or storage of refrigerants. So you can see here the A2Ls are classified as 1B, whereas the hydrocarbons are classed as 1. And then under TDG, which really governs shipping today, the A2Ls and the A3s are really classified the same as class 2.1. So it's just important if you're talking to different people, there are different classifications according to the governing bodies. So what's new with cylinders? So one of the things we're going to see is the cylinders. Certainly the cylinders will be identified differently. This is a photo of one of our commercial products in the A2L family. You'll see it has a red top on it. There'll also be different fittings. They're going to have a left-hand thread. It's a 1/4 inch flare, but left-hand thread. So the adapters, oddly enough, I think before we even had the cylinder out in the marketplace, the adapters were already out there. But we certainly had to do something, and this was an industry choice to go to a different fitting to make it obvious that if you're hooking onto this system or onto this cylinder, you know something is different. The larger cylinders will also have a left-hand thread fitting as well. So the next thing is ASHRAE Standard 34. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're used to working refrigerants in the A1 classification. There's really not a lot of A2s. I don't know of any that are really commercial in the refrigeration sector, but certainly we've seen the propanes and that in the A3 category, and they're very different, the A2Ls and the A3s. And the primary difference is really between the lower flammable limit, how much concentration would form a combustible mixture, and the energy or heat of combustion. That's where the A2Ls and the A3s are really different. But I like to show this test. This is one of the tests that they use to determine flammability. It's called the ASTM E681. So this is what a class 1, so this is what 410A or R22 would look like. And there's combustion, and oddly enough, that yes, even with the non-flammables, there are combustion, but the way they determine whether it's combustible or not, does the flame spread go beyond 90 degrees? So there's a class 1. Here's a class 2L, and it's like, geez, it just falls outside of that 90 degrees, so it ends up being a flammable class. But I'm going to show you a hydrocarbon, a propane, or an isobutane. It's very different, and this is what it does. It basically fills the vessel with as it combusts in here, and you can see that although the 2Ls are combustible, they are very similar to class 1s, but nonetheless, due to the testing method, they fall into the flammability category. The next thing, I'm going to quickly run through a couple of charts, and this is 454B and A2L in this column. This is propane and A3 in this column. So we're going to run through several different tests that they do on flammability. So the first one is lower flammable limit. So this is how many grams of refrigerant would leak into a space, in this case, a cubic meter. You can kind of envision a cubic meter. How much would you need to form a combustible mixture? So you can see that with a propane, you need a very small amount, whereas an A2L, in this case, 454B, you need a much larger amount to form a combustible mixture. So this is good. This is what you want, something that a larger leak would need to occur to get into a combustible mixture. The next thing we're going to show is minimum ignition energy. So how much energy does it take to ignite this combustible mixture? So with a propane, you can see you need very little energy to ignite this, a static spark from a carpet as an example. Whereas with the A2Ls, in this case 454B, it's way more energy. So this is good. We want something that's harder to ignite than a propane. So when we get to the next one is burning velocity. This one's a little bit difficult to visualize, but it's how fast the flame accelerates, or the velocity of the flame. There are some lab tests you can show. I'm going to show you a little video in a minute, but you can see here that we want something with a low flame velocity, very slow. So this is 5.2 centimeters in a second. So you can visualize this. whereas this is 46, much higher flame velocity. So again, the A2Ls are developed really to come up with a safer solution than the A3s. The next thing you'll see is heat of combustion. So this is how much energy is released. Again, you want something lower. You want something that if there were to be combustion, it would be a lower amount of energy. So you can see here, the A2Ls have a much lower amount of energy released or heat of combustion. So I wanted to summarize this, is that what does this really mean? So the A2Ls are less likely to form a flammable concentration. This allows larger charge sizes and for larger systems. They're harder to ignite. This is really good because it allows some of the common electrical components to be used. You know, we're not talking explosion-proof equipment like you may see with hydrocarbons, but it's very different. A2Ls, again, because of the properties, if they were to ignite, the ignition event is much less severe. So these are some good things that we see in the A2Ls and how they're different than A3s. So I thought I would show this video here. I may have to just click on this. So this shows a hydrocarbon. So this is propane. You can see, no kidding, it lights up like a torch, right? At high flame velocity, easy to ignite. So here's an A2L. This is 1234YF. This is what's in the automotive air conditioning today in cars, and it's been there for many years. You can see it's very difficult to ignite, won't sustain a flame. So I thought this was a good video to kind of show that, yeah, the A2Ls, although combustible, are very different than an A3 in terms of ignition energy, flame velocity, these types of things, which will allow different types of equipment and handling practices. So jumping to the next slide, let's look at solutions. So what are the solutions in place as we look at the regulations that the US has, the 700 GWP limits, the 300 GWP limits, and the 150 GWP limits? So within the Opteon family, these are the different sectors. So I put in here, now again, this is a summary. Things may come out a little bit different in Environment Canada's final state, but this is a high level look at what the solutions are, the manufacturers are transitioning to. So we look at residential, commercial AC and heat pumps. So this is ducted splits, rooftop units, light commercial, mini splits. So you can see there really isn't any refrigerants that fall into the non-flammable category here, but you can see that they're transitioning mainly to 454B and R32 in this sector. Some were transitioned to 454C. We've seen a little bit of 454C in heat pumps in Europe. We may see some of that here, but primarily this market is going 454B and R32, both A2L refrigerants. On the chiller front, there are a couple of refrigerants that fall into the non-flammable or no flame propagation category. Is 513A. It's below 700 limit. We're seeing this used in ice rinks. We're also seeing it used in other applications, but it's kind of like 134A. So really can't get down really low in refrigeration temperatures, this type of thing. And XP30 is really a 123 lookalike. So the chillers manufacturers that were using 123 in the past will likely begin to offer and have already started to offer 514A in that air conditioning. But when we look at the 2Ls to get below to the 700 limit, we're seeing again 454A, 454C, and 454B in this market. I think mostly in the chiller market, depending on the manufacturer, may see some of all of these different things in the chillers. When we look at the regulation in the US with the smaller than 200-pound refrigerant charge, less than 300 GWP, there's really three options, but I think in this sector, we're primarily going to see 454A and 454C, and likely a transition more to 454A in this sector. And then when we get to the larger systems where the requirement in the US regulations is less than 150, it really comes down to two And we're primarily going to see, I think in this case, 454C. But you can see when we look at the 2Ls, there's really primarily 454A, 454B, and 454C that are going to become commonplace in air conditioning and refrigeration as we transition to lower GWPs and new equipment. So that's where we really look at it as 454A, B, and C, the ABCs of refrigeration. Less than 300 when that's required. In most cases, it's likely going to transition to 454A or XL40. And it really, that 454A really looks like 404A. And I think the condensing unit manufacturers are migrating this way because of the refrigeration capacities and the design similarities to 404A systems. When we look at 454C, it really kind of has the capacity of R22, and really the decision factor is going to be, when do I need less than 150 GWP? And that's where we may see more of a trend towards this, particularly in the larger systems. But I know some people have already asked me, is A for medium temp and C is for low? It's like, no, they both have similar boiling points. They can both do medium and low temp refrigeration. It's really going to come down to what is the GWP requirement and what the manufacturers have migrated to. And then when we look at XL41 or 454B as the primary alternative for replacement of 410A in air conditioning equipment, and it really has properties similar to that of 410A, and will be used quite a bit in the air conditioning market and heat pump markets. So I wanted to show you this. It gives you some insight into what goes on in our labs and how we do things. But 410A is made up of R32 and 125. So it's a blend of 50-50 of those two components. There's the GWP. It ended up being non-flammable in A1 because of the amount of 125 that was added to basically nullify the flammability of R32, which is an A2L. It also enhanced the properties a little bit. But now the solution, came out and said, okay, we need a lower GWP. What are you guys at Chemours are going to do? So, of course, we looked at it and they thought, well, what can we do? We would like to come up with something that looks like 410A, but has lower GWP. So what we did is we said, okay, let's take 1234YF, which is used in the automotive sector, has a very low GWP. So we replaced the 125 with 1234YF, but both are A2L, so hence the blend ends up being an A2L. But look at the impact on the GWP. It goes from 2088 to 466, well below the 700 requirement that's in place in the US for 2025 for air conditioning. So that's how it came about. But it also shows you too that 454, there's A, B, and C. They're all 454A, B, and C are all made up of these two refrigerants, 32 and 1234YF. The difference between A, B, and C is different percentages. So this is what ASHRAE standard 34 looks like. Anyway, I just thought I'd give you some insight as to how that came about. Now, 410A versus 454B, how do they look? I mean, really, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time, but pressure temperature wise, very close. This is a pressure temperature chart, very similar in performance in terms of vapor pressures, energy efficiencies, capacities. And that was really one of the cool things about 454B. It really looks like 410A. So jumping to the next chart, who has adopted what? So these decisions were really up to the equipment manufacturers. They decided based on what their criteria was. Did it look like 410A? Was it the GWP that they already have equipment with 32? But you can see here that many of the equipment manufacturers, Carrier, York, Lennox, Trane, and many of their product lines are transitioning to 454B. Some, we look at Daikin as an example, is transitioning to 32. And oddly, I'll say some manufacturers, some of their lines may go 454B, some of their lines may go 32, commercial versus residential as an example. But when we look at it, these decisions were really made by the manufacturers. And it's really hard to say, time will tell, but I think it might be 60% or 70% of the manufacturers are going 454B, and 30 to 40% of the manufacturers are moving to 32. So it's hard to say, but time will tell where that ends up. But certainly both refrigerants are going to be commonplace as alternatives to 410A in residential like commercial. Now I wanted to show you this, show you a little bit of comparison between 32 and 454B and 410A. You know, here you can see 410A is an A1, 32 and 454B are in the lower flammability class of A2L. Small amount of temperature glide in 410A and 454B, but again, you know, the temperature glide is very small in these refrigerants. And I'm going to clarify this. It says top up after leak. This means that if I have a 454B system or a 32 system and it were to leak that refrigerant, I can then top it back up with that same refrigerant. You should never mix refrigerants. You should never put 32 in a 454B system or vice versa. And you should never put 454B or 32 in a 410A. So you cannot top up a 410A system with either of these refrigerants. You cannot do that. You should always stick to what refrigerant is in the system. And just to highlight one thing to keep in mind, that from what we've heard from the manufacturers, the oils, although all POE oils, there may be different viscosities of the oil, so it's something to watch for. The other thing, certainly the GWPs of these refrigerants much lower than the 2088 of 410A, and both below the 700 limit that's in place in the US, well below that 700 limit in both cases. So let's talk quickly about equipment. So equipment, you know, the service equipment, what's different? And really the difference is going to be the valve fitting. There's adapters available. Certainly if you're using a gauge set on different refrigerants, you know, don't cross-contaminate. But when we look at equipment, the recovery machines and the vacuum pumps, they've been available for a few years now. So you may already have a unit that's compatible or suitable or approved for the A2Ls. But certainly if you're buying a new one in the next year or two, make sure you're looking at one that's got the approval on it, the sticker on it on the box that says it's approved for use with A2L refrigerants. Looking at transportation of dangerous goods, I wanted to mention this, hauling refrigerant in our trucks. So certainly the cylinders with A2Ls need to be upright, and upright means that the valve, the pressure relief valve is in the valve, so this needs to be in the vapor space. So the cylinder can be at an angle, but you certainly cannot have them lying down. There's also exemptions, 150 kilogram and 500 kilogram exemptions in transportation of dangerous goods, which allows us to transport refrigerants without placards. So those are in place. But our friends at HRAI are working feverishly on many things to do with A2Ls. But one of them is developing an industry solution for shipping large cylinders, because it's above the quantity limit to allow them to be shipped under these exemptions. So our friends at HRAI are working feverishly to come up with a solution on that one. Installation and service. So servicing equipment, what's different? And the reality of it is a lot of it's the same. We just need to do what we've been trained to do in college or in trade school. You really need to make sure that circuits are purged with an inert gas, you know, nitrogen. It's really kind of been a best practice, but you really got to do it. You have to evacuate circuits, and you have to leak test and pressure test systems. So this is something we've been doing already, but certainly these are some of the things we must, without a doubt, do as we transition to A2Ls. Now let's talk quickly about codes and standards, you know, in Canada and the US, and how they interact and what those requirements might be. So in Canada, we have really two things. We have UL CSA. There's two standards, 60335, 2-89, and there's 2-40. This is the requirements that the manufacturers use or are used to build their equipment. If I'm building A2L equipment, this gives them information on, labeling the requirements, fitting the requirements, these types of things. B52, which is the Canadian equivalent to ASHRAE 15 in the US. I say equivalent, it's very similar, and certainly ASHRAE 15 was used as a guide in writing B52, but it really provides information on mechanical rooms, on the requirements around installation. But oddly enough, both of these standards do have some areas that cover not only design, but installation. So the manufacturers of equipment need to follow both of these when they're designing their equipment and providing guidance on installation. And certainly when we look at air conditioning units, when you see that first box is shipped to your location, you go to install it, there's going to be a document in there that's going to have a few more pages in it than before, which is going to provide guidance on the installation requirements. Now, in terms of adoption, certainly the national building codes and the provincial codes need to adopt this, and that's well underway. And certainly our friends at HRAI have been working feverishly on getting provincial adoptions. And most of the provinces are expected to be adopted by late this year, if not early next year, that will provide guidance on the use of A2Ls for the technicians and the engineers, et cetera, on installation. So this chart is from HRAI, but they may have an updated one. I know Sandy's doing a talk later. He may update this chart a little bit, but my hat's off to Sandy and the team at HRAI for the work going on here. Now, what does this mean for us in terms of installation? And it's a little bit tricky for us to really get into detail on this, because this is, up to the manufacturers of the equipment to some extent. But what we're going to see to minimize the chance of having a combustion event with A2Ls, we're going to see some things like refrigerant sensors. We're going to see ventilation air. We're going to see circulation air. So an example would be a ducted home air conditioner. You're likely going to see a leak detector in the A coil. And then that A coil, that sensor, if it detects a leak that is 25% of the lower flammable limit, so well below the limit which could form a combustible mixture, that sensor is going to send a signal to a board to say, hey, let's shut this unit down, let's shut off the burner, and let's shut off the refrigerant coming into the home. So that's something you're going to see there. When we look at, and the other thing that sensor will likely do is turn on the air handler fan on the residential unit. So it's going to do those three things. But circulation will help ensure that there isn't pooling or a high concentration in one area. When we look at walk-in coolers, if there, someone is going to have to start doing the calculation of how big is the refrigerant charge, how big is the walk-in cooler area, and if this were to leak in that room, would it get within 25% of the lower flammable limit? So we may see things in walk-in coolers like refrigerant sensors that shut off that evaporator coil in that unit. We may see things like ventilation air into that space. We may see things like circulation air. So it's really dependent on the solution. It's going to be a little bit different when we first see this, but you're going to see more guidance on this from the manufacturers and more training. And I know HRAI, again, my shout out to them again I know they've put together a training program as well in handling A2Ls. So that concludes my presentation. I wanted to give a few minutes for questions, and just quickly in review, I guess, certainly in review that the A2Ls are coming. They are different. They are in this lower flammability class. Yes, they are flammable. We are going to have to do things a little bit differently in service. The equipment is going to be a little bit different. The leak detectors, this type of thing. The performance and efficiency is going to be better, the same or better than what it was with the old refrigerants. The manufacturers are rapidly transitioning to this. I mean, the air conditioning manufacturers, we have bulk storage tanks delivering refrigerant to these manufacturers already in place. So it's happening. And we're going to start to see 454B, 32, and certainly ABC, 454B and C in refrigeration as well, as we get into this year, and particularly as we get into next year when the codes and standards are in place and the U.S. manufacturers are no longer allowed to manufacture, with higher GWP refrigerants. I say U.S. manufacturers, but certainly manufacturers in Canada and around the world are transitioning their lines to meet the U.S. requirements. So we certainly can't be relying on, old inventory for 5 years, if Canada doesn't implement 700 GWP restrictions on new equipment. So anyway, that concludes my talk. And I think if there's questions, I think we can open it up for a few questions. I think we have a few minutes left.
Yeah, we actually have plenty of time. So we have people, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I've written down some of the questions we've had during the presentation. So we will, hopefully I haven't missed anybody's. So let's start out. So I'll read Pierre Blaine's question. So he asks, if I relate to one of the previous slides, it means that Quebec will not be able to sell R410 units, even if they were built prior to the new regulation.
Yeah, so right now we got to remember it, and that's something we may need to double check on is the Quebec regulation. Sorry, I didn't touch on that because Quebec does have slightly different regulations, and that's something that I would have to confirm. But keep in mind that the Environment Canada level, there is no 750 GWP limit today. It's really a US limit at this point where they can no longer manufacture import equipment into the US as of the end of this year. Will Environment Canada adopt the same regulations? One would think they might, but we will see. And will Environment Quebec do the same thing? I know the regulations in Quebec are slightly different. I do not believe there's a restriction on that, but that's something that I think we could go back and have a look at and maybe confirm. So if we could ensure that we have his email, we can go back and have a look at that. So thank you for that question.
I will make note of that. So our next question we had was, I am sorry, I'm going to try my best. I hope I don't mispronounce your last name, but we have William Chacon. He asks, are there any recent or upcoming regulations regarding the storage of A2L cylinders that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so certainly the storage of these refrigerants, again, you may recall they're classified under GHS as 1B. So it's a different category than propane or isobutane, which are category is class 1 under GHS. So the storage and handling, or sort of the storage of refrigerants is different, but certainly what can be followed is something called NFPA 55, and it has limitations on the amount of refrigerant that can be stored in an area, but the storage requirements are quite similar to those of an A1. But that would be something to work with your local inspectors on and that sort of thing. And I know I'm really pumping up HRAI here. They've done an excellent job. I know they have a document that talks about the storage requirements, but certainly if you are approached by a fire marshal or an engineer and you want to ask him about this, certainly make them aware of the HRAI document, and also make them aware that under GHS, it's classified as a 1B flammable, not a class 1 highly flammable under GHS, because that really tells you that it's different. But generally, the requirements are quite similar to those of an A1, but it's really something that is difficult with the local inspectors and stuff like that. But there is that document from HRAI that can be helpful, and I know they're updating it as well. So thank you.
All right. So we had kind of more of a comment, but I figured we could at least throw this one out there as well. So Andrew Steele wrote, all these new refrigerants are helping, but the other issue is the development of a better access port for gauges like they have in the automotive industry. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to share on that one, Tim?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the access port on auto. When they went from 134A to 1234YF, they switched to a different fitting. Again, to make it obvious, and the automotive sector has specialized equipment for each one. But certainly in this sector, what I understand is happening, and this is what the OEMs tell me, the original equipment manufacturers in the stationary market, is that they are transitioning to they are not changing this fitting on the system. So a residential ducted system will still have the 1/4-inch right-hand flare on it. But maybe what you're getting at is that the small self-contained equipment over the years, I'm like a home appliance, does not have any fittings on it. You got to use saddle valves and these types of things. That will likely continue. And certainly we've seen also with the residential stuff, the small home appliances, the home refrigerators, a lot of that sector has transitioned to hydrocarbons. And I'm really not up to speed with what fittings are on there. But I can tell you the 410A units and air conditioning, as they transition the new equipment from 410A to 454B or 32, what I've been told from the OEMs, that they will have the same 1/4-inch flare fitting that they had with 410A. So there will be no change in the fitting from what I've been told. So I hope that answers your question, but I know there's kind of two areas on that one. So
Thanks, Tim. So another question we had, this one was from Grayson Gould. He said, are manufacturers likely going to require mitigation on everything, exemption for lower charge size residential?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with the lower charge residential, I suspect that again, what I've been hearing is that a 410A will be shipped. It will come with the leak sensor. It will come with the board, and it will, if it's wired in with a new furnace, it would already have that circuitry in there. If it's an aftermarket, like if you're putting in a new condensing unit and a new evaporator, but not a new furnace, there will likely be a circuit board that will come with the unit that you'll then wire into. I forget the colors of the wires that come from the thermostat to control the gas valve or to control the fan. But with the A2L equipment, it will come with a separate circuit board, which you'll then wire into that, the taps for the thermostat, so that board will be there, the sensor will be there, and it will then control the gas valve, control the ventilation fan, as an example. So my understanding is that in most cases in residential, that it will come with that leak sensor and the board to manage the air handler or the furnace, if I can put it that way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. So we had one other question. Otherwise, people keep coming in with questions. We still have plenty of time. So the question we have here is this one is from Simon Lessard. So he said, for Ontario, the building code refers to CSA B5213. If we are planning an installation in a mechanical room in the coming months, can we apply the new CSA B5223 for the installation design?
Yeah, so right now, I guess, B52 is published. It has to be adopted by the province. The province of Ontario right now is in the process of reviewing it. And I believe they've actually put it out for comment on adoption. So when we get into next year, if you're designing a mechanical room, you would certainly like to design to the latest standard, that being the 2023 version of B52. And one would hope that the province will have it adopted as we get into next year. But to answer your question, that's really up to the inspectors to make that call. But we have a pretty high level of confidence that Ontario will have adopted B52, by the end of this year into the first quarter. But again, it's, we really can't speak on behalf of TSSA here in Ontario, so it's hard to say, but that would be a question to pose to them. I'm looking at installing an A2L in a mechanical room next year. The B52 is published. Ontario is working on adoption. Should I go ahead and do that? And that's really up to them. You may be able to talk to them and get can't remember the right term, an approval or a variance to say that, yeah, even though it's not done, I'm doing it to this. Can I do that? So that may be something to do in advance and a discussion to have with them directly. So sorry, that's a difficult question to answer, and really that's really up to them. But I think you're making good sense to say, yeah, if I'm building a mechanical room next year, I should really use the latest code. But we really need to get all the provinces adopted. But it's going to be very problematic, because if the provinces don't adopt B52 and don't allow A2Ls to follow the guidance of UL CSA 60335 2-40 and 2-89 and CSA B52, we may get into a bit of a pickle next year that some equipment may not be available with 410A. So there may be cases that if the province doesn't allow it, we may be in a place where we can't provide air conditioning because the solution doesn't exist, because the equipment is no longer available. So it's real important to encourage the province to get it adopted. And if you have an opportunity to comment with any of the provinces, yeah, please tell them, please get this adopted, because it may make for some very difficult times if we don't get CSA B52 adopted in a timely fashion.
Thanks, Tim. So Andrew Steele has a follow-up to his previous question. So to remind you, his comment, to remind you, he was the gentleman that asked about the port for gauges. So he wrote, yep, you cannot take gauges off of a system, residential, without losing Freon to the atmosphere, as you cannot pump down a unit without the compressor internal relief working.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, again, I mean, the gauge set, I mean, the hoses have a check valve in the end, right? And the fitting on the system, does have a Schrader valve in it. So technically there should be no or de minimis venting, when connecting a gauge set up to the system. I know you can run into situations where you have leaking Schrader valves, but I know you guys have that magical tool, which I've seen used, that can change the leaking Schrader valve without discharging the system. So that really cool magical tool that you can put on that can change the Schrader insert without changing it. But again, the system and the hoses do have the Schrader valves, the check valve in the hose, the check valve in the system. So you should be able to service the system with pretty de minimis venting. And certainly when you do hook up your recovery machine to the system again, it'll pull it down to a slight vacuum to minimize the release of refrigerant. And it is a real important point. I think no matter what refrigerant is being used, whether it's a hydrocarbon or whether it's an HFC or one of these A2L class refrigerants, venting and recovery is critical. I mean, the environmental impact doesn't occur if the refrigerant is never vented. And that's a very important point. And it's good to hear questions about this. How do I minimize venting, and how do I do that? Because that's what it's all about. And systems over the years, I think, have gotten a lot tighter, and certainly in Canada, the training requirements in the refrigeration sector and the air conditioning sector, I think in Canada we do a really, really super job of recovery, recycle, reclamation, and even destruction through, again, I'll pump up HRAI again through our association with Refrigerant Management Canada, that will take back refrigerants for destruction at end of life to prevent them from being vented. So anyway, I'm not sure I answered your question, but I've tried to do the best I can with that one.
Yeah, Andrew followed up with, you cannot get all gauges on with all the adapters in the field.
All gauges on, yeah. Again, I don't quite understand the question, because the standardized fittings on the air conditioning units are 1/4 inch flare hoses are 1/4 inch flares, and the 3 hoses on the gauge set, will fit onto the cylinder and then fit onto the recovery machine. So yeah, you should be able to connect. Now certainly the different systems are, again, the cylinders will be a different fitting, but the fittings on the systems will be the same.
Yeah, this is caused. We have a little bit of a conversation now in the chat, which is lovely. We love seeing this. So one SF Mohammed asked if he was asking about the 5/6 adapters, and Grayson followed up with, yeah, some of the check valve hoses don't fit well on mini splits. I still like having some ball valve hoses. They're slightly smaller.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Because certainly some of the hose sets, you can get the little ball valve fitting on the end, and I know you get into PTACs and mini splits. They can really cram those things in there, and they're pretty hard to get a hose on there with a ball valve in the end or what have you. And I know that equipment manufacturers in some places, it can be pretty tight. I've seen that in terms of access and getting the fittings on. I mean, they're trying to build the unit small and compact as well. And but yeah.
Okay, we have a couple other questions as well. So Darren Skeen asked, how are the trade schools adopting with these new regulations? I am concerned that the next generation of plumbers and HVAC tradespeople won't get the proper training during these apprenticeships. It has been a while since I was in school, so maybe they have adopted.
Yeah, so training is a really good point. And I think, how does that saying go? What the only thing that remains the same is change. So I really feel for you guys that are out with the tools in the industry. I mean, not only you're faced with refrigerant changes, but you're faced with the internet, you're faced with wireless thermostats, you're faced with all this stuff. You guys have got to be experts in everything. Now we're going to be faced with AI, and is this thermostat going to try and outsmart me? So I really feel for you guys that, yeah, training is a continuous process. And certainly HRAI is offering some training on A2Ls. I mean, the fundamental thermodynamic cycle, and, how do I detect a leak, or how do I determine if my condenser is the problem, or what have you. All those practices that we learned in trade school are all the same, right? None of that has changed. And the A2L stuff, if I can call it that, is sort of an add-on. And certainly our industry association has a program that's available to get some training. And certainly the colleges across the country, we get calls from them, and we advise them that, yeah, you need to add this to that. And I have been to some of the colleges across the country, as have others, and they are adopting this and adding this to their training program as well, and that is in process. And so it's a good question, and yeah, that's ongoing right now. And like I say, we get calls from those folks, and we provide them with some help, and as does our industry association, and as do some of the organizations and the manufacturers help provide the colleges to get them up to date. And we went through this many years ago when we introduced HFCs and polyester oil and all that other stuff, and we had developed training material for them, and yeah, we're in support of the colleges and the training centers as well, and getting up to speed with 2Ls, because it's really super important, because we're already seeing R32 and window shakers and this type of thing already, and we're going to start to see it in mini splits. I've heard there's some mini splits already installed in Canada with 454B or 32, and we're really going to start to see it. So training is extremely important, and yeah, we're certainly working with those training organizations to get them up to speed.
So we have just under a minute. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to have quite enough time to be able to touch base on Terry Pike's question. So Terry, if you're still in the chat, I'll make sure that Tim gets your question, and we'll follow up with it following the presentation. Otherwise, I'm going to do our little bit of a wrap up. We have a 5-minute break now. I also wanted to make sure you guys receive that. So you go get your coffee or go to the bathroom, whatever you guys choose to do with your 5 minutes. But our next session starts back up at 2:10. We have a case study. It's going to be exploring a retrofit of Mitsubishi Electric's head office with Gary Chang. So make sure that you tune in for that presentation. So I will see you guys all in about 5 minutes. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. That was fantastic.
All right, and thank you everybody for your time. It was great, and certainly you can email me if you have any questions. My email is on the screen there. So, thank you, and thank you, Leah. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.